"Don't touch him. You'll make it worse." The voice cut through the crystal-lit ballroom just as the glass slipped from Edward Whitmore's hand and shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp, final, echoing beneath a ceiling painted with gold and history. And for a split second no one moved. Not the executives in tailored tuxedos. Not the women frozen mid-laugh with champagne still hovering inches from their lips. Not even the musicians whose notes died quietly in the air. Because the most powerful man in the room, the man who owned the building, the company, and half the city, had just collapsed, his body folding in on itself like something suddenly unplugged. And in that silence, Marcus Reed felt it before he understood it. The shift in the air, the wrongness, the way Edward's chest didn't rise the way it should, the way his skin seemed to lose color under the warm chandelier light, and Marcus, standing at the edge of the room in a pressed gray janitor's uniform that no one had noticed all night, tightened his grip on the cleaning cloth in his hand as every instinct he had tried to bury years ago came rushing back. Training he never finished, lessons half-remembered from a life that had taken a different turn, and still no one moved. Because someone like Edward Whitmore didn't fall. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Not without someone else in charge. And the guests looked to each other instead of to him, waiting for a signal, a permission, anything that would tell them what to do. But there was none. Only the faint, uneven sound of a man trying, and failing, to breathe. And Marcus felt his pulse hammer in his ears as he stepped forward. One step across polished marble that reflected the entire room back at him like a mirror, showing him exactly what he was. Invisible, out of place, a man who was supposed to stay in the background, to clean up messes after they happened, not step into them, not interrupt, not touch. And yet the distance between him and Edward closed with each step. The weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him even before they realized what he was doing. And when someone finally noticed, a woman's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "What are you doing?" But Marcus didn't answer, because there was no time for explanations. Only the stillness of a body that shouldn't be still, the faint tremor in Edward's fingers that wasn't enough, not nearly enough, and Marcus dropped to his knees beside him, the cold marble biting through the fabric of his uniform, his hands hovering for just a fraction of a second above a man who had never once looked at him. Not really. A man who had passed him in hallways like he was part of the furniture. And in that single suspended moment Marcus made a choice, not about rules, not about status, not about what anyone in that room would think, but about something simpler, something older, something that didn't ask permission. And then he moved, steady, certain, his world narrowing to breath and timing and the fragile line between life and something else, while behind him the room that had once felt untouchable began to fracture. Whispers rising, footsteps shifting, a ripple of disbelief spreading outward like cracks in glass, because the one person no one expected to act had just stepped into the center of everything, and nothing about this night would ever be the same again. Marcus Reed did not see the room anymore. He saw only the pattern, the rise that was missing, the pause that was too long, the silence where breath should have been, and his hands moved with a memory his life had tried to erase. 2 fingers finding the side of Edward Whitmore's neck, searching, waiting, counting, 1 second, 2 seconds, nothing steady enough to trust, and the noise behind him grew louder, voices overlapping, uncertain, offended, afraid, but still no one stepped in, no one knelt beside him, because no one in that room had ever been trained to see a man like Edward as fragile, and Marcus leaned closer, his ear near Edward's mouth, feeling only a faint trace of air. Inconsistent, shallow, wrong, and he exhaled slowly, grounding himself, remembering the way his mother used to say it. Calm is what keeps people alive. Panic is what takes them away, and for a fraction of a second he hesitated, not because he did not know what to do, but because he knew exactly what it would look like, what it would mean, a janitor, in front of donors and executives and cameras hidden in corners, crossing a line that people like him were never supposed to cross. And then Edward's chest stilled again, and the decision made itself. Marcus placed one hand over the center of his chest, firm but controlled, the other steadying his position, his movements precise, measured, not rushed, not frantic, and the first compression was quiet, almost invisible beneath the fabric of a custom suit, but it carried intent, and then another, In another, a rhythm forming, steady, deliberate, the kind that did not ask permission, and the room reacted. A man in a navy suit stepped forward as if to pull him away but stopped halfway. Unsure, a woman covered her mouth, eyes wide, as if witnessing something she did not understand, and someone whispered, "Call a doctor, call 911." But no one had done it yet. No one had taken that step, and Marcus kept going, counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, his voice low, controlled, his focus absolute, until the moment came when he had to choose again. And he did not look up, did not wait for approval. He simply acted, tilting Edward's head gently, opening the airway the way he remembered, careful, respectful, as if the man in front of him could feel every motion. And for a brief second the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath with him, the chandeliers above casting a soft glow over a scene that no one would have believed if they had not seen it themselves. And Marcus gave what was needed, not out of impulse, not out of emotion, but out of purpose, then returned immediately to the rhythm, compressions. Steady, consistent, his shoulders aligned, his breathing controlled, and somewhere in the distance he heard footsteps moving faster now. Urgency finally catching up to reality. But he did not look back. He did not stop, because in that moment the only thing that mattered was the fragile line he was holding in place, the thin thread between silence and return. And for the first time since Edward Whitmore had fallen, the room was no longer frozen. It was watching, truly watching, as the man they had not seen all night refused to disappear when it mattered most. The rhythm did not break. Not when the first security guard finally pushed through the crowd. Not when a voice behind Marcus said step away from him now. Not even when a hand hovered uncertainly near his shoulder, because Marcus had already crossed the point where outside noise mattered. His world reduced to timing and pressure and the faint, almost imperceptible responses beneath his hands. And then it happened, subtle at first, a shift so small it could have been imagined, a slight resistance where there had been none, a fragile return that made Marcus pause for less than a heartbeat before continuing, adjusting, watching, waiting, and he leaned closer again, listening not just with his ears, but with every instinct he had. And this time there was something there, uneven, shallow, but real, and the breath that followed was not his. It was Edward's, faint but unmistakable, and Marcus felt it against his cheek like a signal breaking through static. And for the first time since the collapse he exhaled fully, not relief, not yet, but recognition, and behind him the room shifted again, the tone changing from accusation to confusion, from confusion to something quieter, heavier, and someone said he is breathing. Not loudly, not confidently, but enough for others to hear, enough for the truth to begin settling into a space that had been built on certainty. And the guard who had been ready to pull Marcus away stopped completely now, his posture uncertain, his authority suddenly without direction, and the guests who had stood at a distance leaned in just slightly, as if drawn by something they could not name. And Marcus slowly eased the pressure of his hands, not removing them entirely, not yet, because he knew how fragile this moment was, how easily it could slip back into silence. And he watched Edward's chest, counting the rise, the fall, the pause, adjusting again, supporting the rhythm rather than forcing it, guiding instead of taking over, and the contrast was impossible to ignore now. The man on the floor who had once commanded every room without effort, and the man kneeling beside him who had never been given a room at all. And yet in this moment, it was Marcus who held the center. Marcus who dictated the pace. Marcus who understood what the others did not. And then footsteps approached with urgency that was finally real, not performative, not delayed. A medical team moving through the parted crowd with purpose and equipment and authority that arrived just seconds too late to be first, and one of them dropped to his knees beside Marcus, eyes scanning, hands ready, voice steady as he asked what happened, and Marcus answered without looking up, his voice calm, measured, giving only what was necessary, not defending himself, not explaining his place, just the facts, the timing, the response. And the medic nodded once, quick, acknowledging what had already been done, what had already been given, and as they took over, attaching monitors, checking vitals, stabilizing the situation with practiced efficiency, Marcus slowly leaned back, his knees aching against the marble, his hands finally still, and for a moment he just sat there, breathing in the quiet that followed, A different kind of silence now, not frozen, not indifferent, but filled with the weight of something undeniable, something that had shifted in front of everyone. And as Marcus rose to his feet, unnoticed for the first time since he stepped forward, he reached for the cleaning cloth that had fallen beside him. The same cloth he had started the night with, and he held it for a second longer than necessary before turning slightly away, because the room was no longer looking at Edward Whitmore, it was looking at him. The shift in attention was immediate and uncomfortable, like a spotlight that had never been meant to turn in his direction, and Marcus felt it before he fully stood upright. The weight of unfamiliar eyes tracing him not as background, but as something else, something they were still trying to understand, and for a brief second, he considered speaking, explaining, saying something to break the tension that now filled the ballroom. But the words never came, because this was not his space to explain himself. It never had been. And so instead he did what he had always done. He stepped back, one quiet step away from the center, then another, his movements careful, controlled, as if returning the room to its original shape by removing himself from it. And behind him the medics worked with efficiency, voices low, coordinated, confirming what everyone now knew but no one had been ready to accept just minutes earlier, that Edward Whitmore was alive because someone had acted when others had hesitated. And yet, even with that truth settling into the room, the discomfort remained, not gratitude, not yet, but something more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into the structure these people understood, because it required them to reconsider what they had seen and, more importantly, what they had not seen before. And Marcus reached the edge of the ballroom where the lighting softened and the reflections on the marble floor became less sharp, more forgiving, and he bent down instinctively, almost automatically, picking up the broken glass from the fallen champagne flute, each piece small, delicate, catching the light as if nothing had happened at all, and his hands moved with practiced care, the same way they always did, steady, precise, unnoticed. And for a moment it almost felt normal again. The quiet task, the familiar rhythm, the sense of being exactly where he was expected to be, but the silence around him was different now, heavier, watching, and he could feel it even without looking up, the way conversations had not resumed, the way laughter had not returned, the way the music had not started again, as if the entire room was waiting for something else to happen, something no one could quite name, and then a voice cut through the stillness, not loud, not commanding, but clear enough to reach him across the polished floor. "Mr. Reed." And Marcus paused, his hand hovering just above a shard of glass. The name unfamiliar in this space, spoken in a tone that did not match the role he had carried all night. And slowly he looked up, not quickly, not reactively, but with the same measured control he had shown from the beginning. And standing several feet away was one of the senior executives, a man whose presence usually dictated movement rather than followed it. And for the first time that night, his posture was not one of authority but of uncertainty, as if he was stepping into something he had never practiced. And Marcus straightened, the cloth still in his hand, his expression calm, unreadable, waiting without expectation, and the man hesitated, just long enough for the entire room to feel it, before speaking again, softer this time. "We need you to stay." And the words hung there, incomplete, not quite in order, not quite a request, but something in between, something that acknowledged what had happened without fully understanding it. And Marcus held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to register the shift, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as acceptance, not as submission, but simply as acknowledgement. And then he stood there, no longer invisible, not yet included, suspended in a space that had not existed for him before, where the rules had changed but no one had explained how. The air did not return to normal. It thickened, shifting from confusion into something sharper, something that needed to find its place. And it did not take long before the tension chose a direction, because not everyone in that room was willing to accept what they had just witnessed without resistance. And a voice rose from the cluster of guests near the center, controlled but edged with disbelief. "This is unacceptable." And heads turned again, not toward Edward this time, but toward Marcus, as if the problem in the room had quietly changed, and the man who stepped forward wore authority like a second skin, cufflinks catching the light, posture rigid with certainty. One of the board members, someone used to defining what was appropriate and what was not. And he did not look at Marcus as a person. He looked at him as a breach, a disruption that needed to be corrected. You had no right to touch him, he said, each word measured, deliberate, echoing just enough to reach the edges of the ballroom. And the statement settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that invited agreement, or at least silence. And for a moment no one challenged it. Not the executives, not the guests, not even the staff who had begun to gather along the walls, because it was easier to return to the structure they understood than to sit inside the discomfort of what had just happened. And Marcus stood where he was, the cloth still in his hand, his shoulders relaxed but steady, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present. And the board member continued, stepping closer now, his voice tightening. There are protocols, there are boundaries. You cannot just insert yourself into a situation like that. And the words were not loud, but they carried an authority that had shaped rooms like this for years, and a few people nodded subtly, relieved perhaps to have someone articulate what they had been thinking, or what they felt they were supposed to think. And Marcus listened. Without interruption, his expression unchanged, his breathing even. And when the man finally paused, expecting either silence or compliance, Marcus spoke, his voice calm, clear, not raised, not lowered, exactly where it needed to be heard without forcing itself into the room. He was not breathing, and that was all he said. No defense, no explanation, just a fact. And for a second the simplicity of it disrupted the structure the board member had been building, because it did not argue, it did not challenge authority directly. It simply existed, undeniable, and the man's jaw tightened slightly, searching for something to counter with, something that would restore the balance he was used to. But before he could speak again, one of the medics looked up from beside Edward, his tone professional, detached from the social tension unfolding behind him. Whoever started compressions did it right, and the sentence landed differently. Not emotional, not dramatic, but clinical, factual, the kind of statement that did not bend for status or perception, and the room absorbed it in silence. The contrast now impossible to ignore, and the board member took a small step back, not a retreat he would acknowledge, but a shift nonetheless. His authority no longer centered in the same way, and Marcus did not move forward, did not claim the space that had opened. He simply remained where he was, grounded, steady, allowing the moment to settle without trying to control it. And in that stillness the tension reached its peak, not in noise, not in chaos, but in the quiet realization that the line between who was supposed to act and who actually did had just been redrawn in front of everyone. The room did not erupt. It exhaled, slowly, unevenly, like it was learning how to breathe again after holding too much for too long. And the sharp edges of confrontation softened into something quieter, something heavier, as the reality of what had happened settled into the space between people rather than above them. And Marcus remained still, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this moment did not belong to him alone. It belonged to what had just been revealed, and the lights above seemed warmer now, no longer harsh against the marble but diffused, reflecting off the floor in long, quiet streaks that stretched between where Edward lay and where Marcus stood, like a line that had been drawn and then gently erased. And the medics continued their work with calm precision, their voices low, their movements steady, confirming vitals, adjusting positions, guiding the return of something fragile but present. And no one interrupted them anymore. No one questioned, no one directed, because the urgency had passed into something more delicate, something that required patience instead of control. And in that stillness the smallest details became louder, the soft rustle of fabric as someone shifted their weight, the faint clink of glass being set down carefully instead of carelessly, the distant hum of the building itself continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And Marcus lowered his gaze for a moment, not in submission, not in retreat, but in reflection, his hands resting loosely at his sides, feeling the slight tremor that came after focus, the quiet release of tension that had nowhere to go until now. And he inhaled slowly, deeply, grounding himself in the same way he had just moments before. But this time there was no urgency attached, only awareness. And across the room someone finally spoke again, not to challenge, not to command, but simply to acknowledge. He saved him, the words barely above a whisper, yet they carried further than any raised voice had earlier, because they did not demand attention. They invited recognition, and one by one the room began to shift around that truth. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, almost imperceptible ways, a posture softening, a gaze lingering a second longer, a silence that no longer felt like avoidance, but like understanding forming in real time. And Marcus did not look up immediately. He let the moment exist without needing to confirm it, without needing to claim it, because he had not acted for this. He had acted because there was no other choice he could live with. And when he finally lifted his eyes, it was not toward the center of the room, not toward the medics or the executives or the crowd that had once overlooked him, but toward Edward, whose chest now rose with a steadier rhythm, each breath more certain than the last. And Marcus watched quietly, not as a hero, not as a witness seeking validation, but as someone who understood how close that rhythm had come to disappearing, and how quietly it had returned. And in that shared silence, without words, without gestures, something shifted that no announcement could capture, something that did not need to be explained because it could be felt in the way the room no longer saw him the same way, even if they did not yet know what to do with that change. It did not happen all at once. It began with a single movement, so small most of the room almost missed it, a subtle shift beneath the medic's hand, a change in rhythm that was no longer assisted but initiated. And then Edward Whitmore's fingers twitched, barely perceptible, yet enough to draw every eye back to him. And the medic leaned in closer, watching carefully, adjusting nothing, simply observing, as if allowing the body to reclaim its own timing. And then came the breath, deeper this time. Fuller, not forced, not guided, but his, entirely his, and a quiet confirmation passed between the medical team. A nod, a glance, the kind that spoke without needing to be announced, and the room felt it before anyone said a word. The return, the undeniable presence of life where minutes ago there had been uncertainty, and Marcus did not move, but something inside him shifted, not relief in the dramatic sense, not triumph, but a steady release, like a weight being set down carefully rather than dropped. And Edward's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, adjusting to the light above him, the reflections, the unfamiliar angle of the world from the floor. And for a moment he did not speak, did not react, he simply breathed, as if rediscovering something he had never expected to lose. And then his gaze moved, not randomly, not searching for the nearest familiar face among executives or staff, but following something quieter, something instinctive, until it landed on Marcus, and the connection held, longer than anyone expected, longer than the room was comfortable with. Because it was not the glance of recognition built on status or history. It was something else, something more direct, more human, and Marcus met that gaze without stepping forward, without stepping back, steady, grounded, and for the first time Edward saw him not as part of the background, not as a role, but as the person who had been there when it mattered most, and his lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came immediately, because whatever he had known about control, about command, about how rooms were supposed to function, had been interrupted in a way that could not be explained with the language he was used to, and the medic gently placed a hand near his shoulder, reminding him to stay still, to breathe, to let the moment pass without rushing it. And Edward complied, but his eyes did not leave Marcus. And in that sustained silence something shifted again, deeper this time, not just in the room but within him, a realization forming not from logic or instruction but from experience, from the undeniable truth of who had acted and who had not. And around them the room remained quiet, no one daring to interrupt, no one stepping in to redirect or interpret, because this moment no longer belonged to structure or hierarchy. It belonged to recognition, and Marcus, still holding the cloth loosely in his hand, stood exactly where he was, not elevated, not diminished, simply present, as the distance between who he had been in this room and who he was now quietly disappeared. Edward did not look away, even as the medics continued to speak around him, even as someone adjusted a light above to soften the glare in his eyes, because the clarity that had returned to him was not focused on the room he owned, but on the man he had never noticed inside it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone in that ballroom had ever heard it, not commanding, not controlled, but grounded in something unfamiliar. Did you stay? And the question seemed incomplete at first, almost fragile, until he drew a slow breath and continued. Did you stay when everyone else stepped back? And the words did not carry accusation. They carried realization, and Marcus did not rush to answer. He did not step forward to claim anything that had already been seen. He simply nodded once, a small movement, steady, enough to confirm what did not need explanation, and Edward closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion alone, but in recognition, as if aligning what he had believed about the world with what had just happened inside it. And when he opened them again, something had shifted, not in posture, not in status, but in how he looked at the space around him, as if the room itself had changed shape without moving. And the board member who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably, his certainty now misplaced, his words no longer anchored to anything solid, and Edward's gaze moved past him without acknowledgement, not out of dismissal, but because the center of importance had quietly moved elsewhere. And when he spoke again, it was not to the room, not to his executives, but directly to Marcus. What is your name? And the question, simple as it was, carried a weight it had never needed to carry before, because it was not a formality, it was a correction, and Marcus answered just as simply. Marcus Reed, his voice even, unshaken, and Edward repeated it once, slower, as if committing it to memory rather than hearing it for the first time. Marcus Reed. And the room absorbed that moment in silence. The name now placed where it had never been placed before, spoken by the one person whose voice defined value in that space. And Edward shifted slightly, the medic guiding him to remain still, but his focus did not break. And then, without raising his voice, without needing to, he said, he stays. And the words were not loud, but they carried further than anything else that had been said that night, because they were not a request, not a suggestion, they were a decision. And the structure of the room responded instantly, not because it understood, but because it always had, the authority that had once defined distance now redefining presence. And yet this time it was different, because the decision did not reinforce a hierarchy, it acknowledged a truth. And Marcus did not react with surprise, did not step into the space that had been opened for him. He simply stood where he was, grounded in the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning. And in that stillness the contrast became complete, not between wealth and poverty, not between power and service, but between what had been assumed and what had been revealed. And for the first time that night, the room did not feel divided, it felt recalibrated, as if something essential had been put back into place without anyone fully understanding how. The room did not return to what it had been. It settled into something quieter, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And the medics carefully prepared to move Edward, their movements coordinated, efficient, but no longer urgent, because the crisis had passed into recovery. And as they lifted him onto the stretcher, Edward's gaze shifted one last time across the room, not scanning, not commanding, but choosing, and it found Marcus again, standing near the edge of the marble floor with the same cloth still in his hand, the same posture he had carried before any of this began. And for a moment neither of them moved, because nothing needed to be added to what had already been seen. And then, slowly, Edward gave the smallest nod, not a gesture of authority, not a signal to be followed, but an acknowledgement that existed outside the structure that had once defined him. And Marcus returned it just as quietly, not as agreement, not as submission, but as recognition. And the exchange passed between them without interruption, without interpretation, leaving the room to absorb it in silence. And as the stretcher was guided toward the exit, the crowd parted naturally this time, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, the path opening without command, without instruction. And when the doors closed behind them, the ballroom remained still, the absence of urgency replaced by something that lingered, something that would not be easily explained in the conversations that would follow. And Marcus stood for a moment longer, then looked down at the floor where the last fragments of glass still caught the light, small, reflective, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. And he knelt again, not because anyone expected him to, not because the moment required it, but because it was what he did, what he had always done. And his hands moved with the same care, the same precision, gathering each piece one by one, restoring the surface to what it had been, or at least what it appeared to be. And around him the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations returning in low tones, footsteps measured, the music not yet resumed, as if even sound needed time to understand what had shifted, and Marcus finished, placing the last shard into the bin, then rose, his reflection faint in the polished marble beneath him, no longer blurred by movement, no longer overlooked, just there, steady, present, and as he turned to walk toward the service hallway, the same path he had taken countless times before, the difference was not in where he was going, but in what remained behind him, a room that had seen something it could not unsee, and would carry it long after the lights dimmed, long after the evening was reduced to stories told in quieter spaces, and Marcus did not look back, not because it did not matter, but because what mattered had already happened, and it did not need to be revisited, only carried forward in the quiet way he understood best, step by step, breath by breath, until even the silence itself felt different.